the mahogany courtroom of the Superior Court building in downtown Portland, Oregon felt suffocating as the morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes, sat elevated on the bench, her black robe draped perfectly as she reviewed her notes before delivering what would be the culmination of a 3-week trial. The air conditioning hummed quietly, barely noticeable beneath the tension that had accumulated over weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and arguments that had captivated the small community. David Hartley, a 28-year-old man with sandy brown hair and desperate eyes, sat rigidly at the defendant's table. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the wood, his knuckles turning white from pressure. His attorney, a middle-aged public defender named Robert Sullivan, sat beside him reviewing final notes, occasionally glancing at his client with the expression of someone who had fought hard but suspected the battle was already lost. Hartley's family occupied the front row of the gallery, his elderly mother clutching a tissue, his sister with her arm around their mother's shoulders, both women looking haunted by the proceedings. They hadn't slept well in months. The charge, arson resulting in death. The alleged crime, deliberately setting fire to Riverside Warehouse on the night of March 15th, a fire that had consumed the structure in flames and claimed the life of Marcus Webb, a 52-year-old night janitor who had been inside the building when the fire ignited. The prosecution had constructed their case methodically, piece by piece, like a master architect building an unassailable fortress. Cell phone records placed Hartley's device near the warehouse at 11:47 p.m. A security camera at a nearby gas station captured someone matching Hartley's approximate height and build entering the warehouse perimeter around midnight. Text messages between Hartley and an unknown contact mentioned needing quick money for a job that pays well. Circumstantial, perhaps, but convincing. The prosecutor, District Attorney Richard Hammond, was a formidable presence, a man in his mid-50s with prematurely gray hair, a commanding voice, and an impressive track record of successful convictions. He had spent the morning delivering his closing argument with theatrical precision, packing before the jury box, his voice rising and falling with calculated emphasis. "Ladies and gentlemen," he had proclaimed, gesturing dramatically toward Hartley, "the evidence is clear. This young man, desperate for money, desperate for attention, deliberately set a fire that killed an innocent, hardworking man. Marcus Webb was a father of 3. He worked nights to support his family. He was murdered by the defendant's greed and recklessness." The jury of 12 men and women sat rigid in their box, most unable to maintain eye contact with Hartley. Some took notes. Others stared straight ahead, their expressions unreadable but their body language suggesting conviction had already formed in their minds. The foreman, a retired accountant named Gerald Foster, had been nodding occasionally during Hammond's argument, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the defense table. In the gallery, approximately 40 spectators filled the courtroom, journalists scribbling notes, curious community members drawn by the tragedy and sensationalism, court employees on break, and a few representatives from local civic organizations. Among them sat James Mitchell, the court stenographer, hunched over his laptop, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. He was a thin man in his early 40s, with receding hair and unremarkable features, the kind of person most people forget within seconds of meeting. He had been recording every word of the trial, his official duty, his neutral expression suggesting complete detachment from the proceedings. Few people in that courtroom knew anything about him beyond his job title. Officer Marcus Chen sat in the back of the gallery, his uniform crisp and perfectly pressed, his badge gleaming in the courtroom light. At his side, alert and composed, sat Detective, a magnificent German shepherd with a rich tan and black coat, his muscular frame and intelligent eyes reflecting years of professional training. Det was a certified accelerant detection dog, trained specifically to identify the chemical signatures of substances used in arson. His nose was a biological instrument more sensitive than any laboratory equipment, capable of detecting accelerant residue at concentrations as low as 1 part per trillion. In 7 years of service, Detective had never made a mistake. His success rate was flawless: 147 successful detections, 0 false alerts. His reputation was beyond reproach. Officer Chen had brought Det to the courtroom as a professional courtesy, requested by the prosecution to serve as a visible reminder of how thoroughly the investigation had been conducted. Det's presence was meant to impress the jury, a statement without words that law enforcement had deployed every available resource to solve this crime. Det sat perfectly still, his training evident in every muscle. He knew courtroom protocol. He had been present at numerous trials, always composed, always professional. But as Judge Morrison prepared to transition the proceedings toward jury instructions and potential sentencing, Officer Chen noticed something he had never observed in Detective before. The dog's entire body began to shift subtly. His ears, normally in a relaxed forward position, perked to full attention. His nostrils flared, drawing in air with deliberate, measured breaths. His eyes, usually soft and friendly, became intensely focused. The muscles in his shoulders tensed. His tail, which had been resting peacefully against the courtroom floor, lifted slightly. Every fiber of the dog's being suddenly communicated one clear message: he was detecting something. Chen felt his heart rate accelerate. He recognized these signs intimately. This was Det's alert posture, the exact configuration of body language and behavior that indicated the dog's sophisticated olfactory system had detected accelerant residue. But that was impossible. The defendant was sitting at the table in front of them. The fire was weeks old. There should be no fresh accelerant in this courtroom. Chen's mind raced through possibilities, but Det's behavior didn't waver. The dog was certain, absolute, unambiguous in his signal. Judge Morrison began speaking. Before we proceed to jury instructions, does the defense have any final motions? Officer Chen made an instant decision. Years of partnership with Detective, years of trusting the dog's instincts absolutely, years of never questioning what his partner was telling him, all of it crystallized into one moment of action. He stood abruptly. Det, understanding the signal, also rose to his feet. The dog's alert intensified, his entire body rigid with purpose. Every head in the courtroom turned simultaneously. Conversation ceased mid-sentence. Journalists straightened in their seats. Judge Morrison's gavel paused mid-gesture. David Hartley's eyes widened in confusion. The prosecution and defense attorneys exchanged bewildered glances. And Detective, the German shepherd who had never been wrong in his professional career, began moving, not toward the defendant's table, but away from it, his nose working methodically through the air, his body language communicating absolute certainty about what he was detecting. The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos the moment Detective rose to his feet, his alert posture unmistakable to anyone with even basic knowledge of police K-9 procedures. Judge Morrison's gavel hovered in midair, frozen in surprise. "Officer Chen, what is the meaning of this interruption?" she demanded, her judicial authority temporarily overshadowed by genuine curiosity about what could have prompted such an unprecedented action during a criminal trial. Officer Marcus Chen didn't respond immediately. His attention was entirely focused on Detective, reading every signal his partner was communicating through body language refined over thousands of hours of professional training. The dog's nose worked in deliberate, methodical patterns, drawing in air from different angles, processing the invisible chemical signatures that human noses could never detect. Det's ears remained fully erect, his eyes intense and unblinking. The muscles beneath his sleek coat rippled with controlled purpose. This wasn't a casual alert or a momentary distraction. This was Detective in full detection mode, completely certain about what his olfactory system was telling him. "Your Honor," Chen said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his body. Detective is indicating a positive alert for accelerant residue. He's never been wrong in 7 years of service. The courtroom fell completely silent. The weight of that statement settled over everyone present like a heavy blanket. Prosecutors and defense attorneys exchanged meaningful glances. Journalists immediately began typing frantically into their laptops, their instincts recognizing that something monumentally significant was unfolding before their eyes. The jury members sat frozen, several leaning forward slightly, trying to understand what was happening. David Hartley's face transformed, confusion giving way to a flicker of hope, then to desperate uncertainty about what this meant for his fate. Detective continued his methodical search through the courtroom, his behavior absolutely certain, his purpose unmistakable. He moved with the deliberate grace of a professional in his element, his nose sampling air currents, his training guiding each step. Officer Chen walked beside him, holding the leash loosely, allowing the dog complete freedom to follow his olfactory investigation. The sound of Detective's nails clicking against the polished courtroom floor echoed through the sudden silence. Click, 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 each step marking the progression of his search. The dog moved past the prosecution table, where District Attorney Hammond sat visibly stunned, his confident demeanor cracked by this unexpected development. Det didn't pause there. He moved past the jury box, where jurors shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that something they hadn't been told might be relevant to their verdict. He bypassed the defendant's table entirely, a crucial detail that several observers immediately recognized as profoundly significant. If David Hartley had been the perpetrator, detectives should have alerted on him or his clothing, but the dog showed no interest in the defendant whatsoever. Instead, detective's trajectory carried him directly toward the gallery section where spectators sat observing the proceedings. His alert intensified. His body language became even more rigid, even more certain. Officer Chen could feel the leash becoming taut as detective pulled with focused determination toward a specific location. The dog was pointing towards someone in the audience, his entire being communicating absolute certainty about what he was detecting. Detective's nose led him directly to James Mitchell, the court stenographer who sat frozen in his chair, his face draining of color so completely that he looked like a ghost. Mitchell's fingers had stopped moving across his laptop keyboard. His body had gone rigid. His eyes had widened to nearly impossible dimensions. For a moment, he seemed unable to process what was happening, as if his brain couldn't reconcile the scene unfolding before him. A police dog, trained specifically to detect arson accelerants, alerting directly on him in a public courtroom during a murder trial. Detective maintained his alert posture, his trained behavior communicating with absolute clarity. This man's clothing, his body, his immediate vicinity contained the chemical signature of accelerant residue. The dog had made his determination, and his entire 7-year track record of flawless accuracy stood behind that judgment. "What the?" Mitchell stammered, his voice barely audible. He attempted to stand, perhaps driven by panic or the instinct to flee, but his legs seemed uncooperative, unstable beneath him. Judge Morrison's gavel came down hard, the sharp crack reverberating through the courtroom. Everyone remained seated. "Security, I want that man detained immediately. Officer Chen, I want a full explanation of what just transpired." Security officers moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding James Mitchell before he could complete his attempted exit from his chair. One officer placed a hand on Mitchell's shoulder, applying gentle but unmistakable pressure that communicated he was not going anywhere. Mitchell's face cycled through multiple emotions: shock, denial, panic, and finally a kind of resigned desperation. Other observers in the courtroom were beginning to comprehend the implications of what had just occurred. If Detective's alert was accurate, and his track record suggested it absolutely was, then the person he had identified was an accelerant-exposed individual. But what was a court stenographer doing with accelerant residue on his clothing? Why would someone sitting in the gallery, someone with no apparent connection to David Hartley or the defendant's case, be covered in the chemical signatures of arson? The journalists in the courtroom were erupting into a frenzy of activity. Typing intensified. Several reporters stepped into the hallway, already making phone calls to their news desks, their voices urgent with the excitement of a breaking story. Within minutes, the narrative of this trial would shift dramatically. What had appeared to be a clear-cut case against David Hartley was suddenly, inexplicably, becoming something far more complicated and far more interesting. David Hartley's mother gasped audibly, her hand covering her mouth. His sister leaned forward, her eyes wide with dawning comprehension. After weeks of watching her brother's conviction appear inevitable, after enduring the emotional torture of watching the prosecution systematically dismantle any hope of acquittal, suddenly, impossibly, something had shifted. The dog's alert represented a potential lifeline, a possibility that their son and brother might not, after all, spend the next several decades of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Robert Sullivan, the public defender, was on his feet immediately, his legal mind recognizing the seismic implications of this moment. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate investigation into why detective has alerted on this individual. I move for the suspension of jury instructions pending a thorough examination of this new evidence." The district attorney, his confidence shattered, was conferring urgently with his team, their expressions reflecting confusion and concern. They had built their entire case around David Hartley's guilt, and now the courtroom had been invaded by the possibility that they had been prosecuting the wrong person. Officer Chen stood calmly beside Detective, his hand resting lightly on the dog's head. The dog had done his job with absolute perfection. He had detected what human investigators had somehow missed. He had walked into a courtroom during a murder trial and identified someone who appeared to carry the chemical signature of the very crime for which an innocent man was being convicted. Detective's alert had just changed everything. The direction of the investigation, the trajectory of David Hartley's life, and the entire understanding of what had actually occurred on the night of March 15th. Judge Morrison's voice cut through the chaos with judicial authority. "Officer Chen, I want you and your dog to remain available for further questioning. Security, ensure Mr. Mitchell doesn't leave this building. I'm recessing this court for 2 hours while we determine what just happened here. When we reconvene, I expect some very clear answers about why a police dog just identified someone other than the defendant as carrying accelerant residue." As the judge struck her gavel again, the courtroom transformed from a space of judicial proceedings into something far more uncertain and mysterious. One faithful dog's instinct had just introduced an element of chaos into what had appeared to be a perfectly organized prosecution. The truth, it seemed, was far more complicated than anyone in that courtroom had previously imagined. The moment Judge Morrison recessed the court, controlled urgency erupted into action. Security escorted James Mitchell to a holding cell, his protestations of innocence falling on ears that had already witnessed detectives' flawless alert. Police detectives who had been observing the trial as professional courtesy suddenly transformed into active investigators, their minds racing through the implications of what had just transpired. Within minutes, federal agents descended upon the courthouse, and the entire investigation that had consumed 3 weeks of trial proceedings was suddenly reopened, redirected, and reimagined around a completely different suspect. Detective remained in the courthouse with Officer Chen, where he was examined by a veterinarian to ensure his alert capabilities hadn't been compromised by stress or environmental factors. The examination was thorough and professional. The dog's olfactory system registered no impairment. His alert had been genuine, undeniable, and absolutely accurate. Detective had done exactly what he was trained to do: identify the presence of accelerant residue. and his 7-year track record of perfection remained unblemished. Meanwhile, in the police department's Major Crimes Division, the work of investigating James Mitchell began in earnest. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Reeves, a sharp investigator with 15 years of experience, sat across from Mitchell in an interrogation room, her demeanor professional but her eyes reflecting the seriousness of the situation. Mitchell, stripped of his stenographer's uniform, sat in a gray jumpsuit, his earlier panic gradually being replaced by a kind of numb resignation. "Let's start with the basics," Reeves said, her voice calm and methodical. "Tell us about your employment history, specifically your work at Riverside Warehouse." Mitchell's eyes darted toward the mirror, one-way glass that he correctly suspected contained observers on the other side. His jaw clenched. For a moment, he seemed to consider lying, constructing some elaborate narrative that might explain away the accelerant residue. But the weight of detectives' alert, the certainty it represented, made deception feel pointless. "I worked there," Mitchell admitted quietly. "Contract cleaning, 6 months before the fire." "And you were terminated from that position?" Reeves asked, already knowing the answer but following interrogation protocol, allowing Mitchell to volunteer information that might incriminate him further. "They said I stole inventory," Mitchell said, his voice carrying bitter resentment. "But I didn't. I was framed. That warehouse owner, he was corrupt. He was probably running insurance scams himself, and when I found evidence of it, he fired me to cover it up." Reeves made a note, her expression unchanged. "Interesting perspective. So you held a grudge against Riverside Warehouse?" "I held a grudge against the owner, yeah," Mitchell said, "but I didn't burn down any building. I was making decent money as a court stenographer. Why would I jeopardize that?" But even as Mitchell spoke the words, investigators working in parallel were uncovering information that directly contradicted his claims of financial stability. Financial records obtained through warrants showed Mitchell carrying significant personal debt. Credit card statements revealed charges at casinos, online betting sites, and loan sharking operations that specialized in high-interest loans to desperate gamblers. Mitchell owed approximately $50,000 to various creditors, money he had no legitimate means of repaying given his stenographer's salary of $38,000 annually. More damaging still, investigators discovered that James Mitchell had taken out an insurance policy on warehouse equipment approximately 2 weeks before the fire. The policy was written through an agent who specialized in insuring commercial equipment and inventory. The policy amount was $45,000, a figure that aligned suspiciously well with Mitchell's gambling debts. The insurance company's fraud investigators were immediately contacted and began their own examination of the policy's legitimacy. Security footage analysis became the next critical piece of evidence. The same team that had previously examined parking lot footage focused on the night of March 15th discovered something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. James Mitchell's personal vehicle, a 2015 Honda Civic with a distinctive dent in the driver's side fender, appeared on multiple security cameras in the warehouse district between 11:15 p.m. and 11:47 p.m. on the night of the fire. The vehicle's trajectory suggested purposeful movement toward the warehouse, not random passage through the area. Furthermore, investigators re-examined cell phone tower data with fresh perspective. While David Hartley's cell phone had pinged off a tower near the warehouse, so had James Mitchell's. But Mitchell's phone had remained in the vicinity far longer than Hartley's, suggesting different levels of engagement with the location. Mitchell's device had lingered in the area for approximately 45 minutes, the time frame consistent with someone arriving, executing an arson, and departing. Investigators also discovered employment records showing that on March 14th, the day before the fire, Mitchell had called in sick to his stenographer position, claiming he had a severe migraine. Yet surveillance footage from various locations in the city showed Mitchell actively moving around, visiting hardware stores, purchasing supplies that could be consistent with arson preparation. One hardware store cashier, shown a photograph by investigators, identified Mitchell as the man who had purchased significant quantities of cleaning solvents and combustible materials on that exact date. The puzzle pieces were beginning to assemble into an undeniable picture. James Mitchell wasn't simply an incidental court stenographer who happened to carry accelerant residue. He appeared to be someone with clear motive, financial desperation, resentment toward the warehouse, and opportunity. He had been near the warehouse at the critical time, had means, the supplies he'd purchased, and he had demonstrated behavior patterns, calling in sick, purchasing materials, entirely consistent with arson preparation. Detective Sarah Reeves returned to the interrogation room with printouts of financial records, employment history, and vehicle tracking data. She laid them methodically on the table in front of Mitchell, each document another piece of evidence crushing the credibility of his denials. "Mr. Mitchell," Reeves said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated proof, "we have evidence that you were near Riverside Warehouse on the night of the fire. We have financial records showing you were deeply in debt to gambling operations. We have insurance policy documentation indicating you stood to gain $45,000 if warehouse equipment was destroyed. We have vehicle tracking data, cell tower pings, hardware store purchases, and now we have Detective, a dog with a 7-year perfect track record, alerting on accelerant residue on your clothing. I would strongly suggest you reconsider your narrative about what happened that night." Mitchell's face crumpled. His bravado, his denials, his carefully constructed narrative about being framed and innocent, all of it shattered in the face of overwhelming evidence. He realized, finally, that there was no path forward through continued deception. The dog's alert had opened an investigation that had dismantled his alibi, exposed his financial motivation, and connected him irrefutably to the crime scene. In another room, investigators were working on David Hartley's connection to Mitchell. How had Hartley become involved? Why had he been at the warehouse? Was he a knowing participant in the arson, or had he been manipulated by Mitchell into a situation where he became the convenient scapegoat? The answers would come through continued investigation, through examining text messages between the two men, through understanding the relationship between a desperate con artist and a vulnerable young man seeking employment. But one truth was already undeniable. James Mitchell's hidden past, his gambling addiction, his financial desperation, his resentment toward the warehouse, his prior employment there, his suspicious insurance policy, and his proximity to the crime scene on the critical night, all of it had been concealed beneath the bland, forgettable exterior of a court stenographer. And none of it would have been uncovered without one faithful police dog who had walked into a courtroom and recognized something that human investigators had completely missed. The forensic laboratory of the Portland Police Department's Major Crimes Division became the epicenter of intensive analysis following detectives' courtroom alert. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the lead forensic scientist, no relation to Officer Marcus Chen, immediately understood the significance of what had just transpired in the courthouse. A dog with a flawless 7-year track record had identified someone carrying accelerant residue during an active murder trial. That wasn't merely interesting. That was potentially case-breaking. Dr. Chen ordered expedited analysis of all materials seized from James Mitchell's person, his vehicle, and his residence. The first critical discovery came within hours. Fibers collected from Mitchell's jacket, the very jacket he had been wearing in the courtroom, matched accelerant traces found at the Riverside Warehouse fire scene. The match wasn't circumstantial or suggestive. It was specific, quantifiable, and scientifically undeniable. The fibers contained trace amounts of the same chemical compound, a specialized accelerant used primarily in controlled demolition and industrial applications that forensic investigators had identified at the fire scene weeks earlier. Dr. Chen personally examined the fibers under electron microscopy, documenting the unique chemical signature through spectroscopic analysis. The accelerant contained distinctive additives that were relatively uncommon in commercial applications, which meant the probability of Mitchell's jacket containing identical residue through coincidence was vanishingly small. The science was clear, unambiguous, and would stand up to the most rigorous defense attorney scrutiny in any courtroom proceeding. Further analysis of soil samples collected from Mitchell's shoes revealed something equally damning. The soil contained industrial residue consistent with the warehouse's loading dock area, where forensic evidence suggested the fire had been deliberately ignited. The soil particles, when analyzed through X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, showed trace concentrations of heavy metals that matched the warehouse environment precisely. Mitchell's shoes had literally been in the location where the arson had been set. The evidence chain was becoming airtight. Dr. Chen expanded the analysis to Mitchell's entire residence, where a search warrant had been executed simultaneously with his detention. The forensic team discovered a storage unit in Mitchell's garage containing items that appeared directly related to arson preparation. Firefighting foam residue covered the interior of a metal container, suggesting accelerant had been stored there. Chemical-resistant gloves showed traces of the same accelerant found at the crime scene and on Mitchell's jacket. A notebook contained sketches of the warehouse's layout, with annotations indicating entry points, locations of security cameras, and what appeared to be timing notations. Most incriminating was a receipt discovered in Mitchell's kitchen drawer, dated March 14th, from a specialty chemical supplier. The receipt documented the purchase of concentrated accelerant fluid, identical to the compound used in the warehouse fire. The receipt name matched a false identification that Mitchell had apparently used, a crude forgery bearing his photograph but a different name, discovered during the residence search. Mitchell had taken precautions to hide his identity when making the purchase, suggesting clear consciousness of guilt and deliberate premeditation. The timeline began to crystallize with devastating clarity. On March 14th, Mitchell had called in sick to his stenographer position, his first absence in 6 months, a behavioral anomaly that drew investigative attention. That same day, he had purchased accelerant through a false identity, demonstrating intentional concealment. That evening, he had collected supplies and prepared materials consistent with arson execution. The following day, March 15th, Mitchell had spent the morning and afternoon continuing preparations, then driven to the warehouse district in the evening, arriving at approximately 11:15 p.m. according to vehicle tracking data. Security footage experts, working with federal investigators, managed to partially restore corrupted video from a camera positioned at a side entrance to the warehouse. While the footage was degraded and incomplete, corruption from the fire's heat had damaged the hard drive. Enough remained to show a figure matching Mitchell's distinctive build and gate entering the warehouse through a service entrance at 11:47 p.m. The figure was carrying what appeared to be a canvas bag, consistent with the bag later discovered in Mitchell's storage unit that contained arson materials. The figure remained inside the warehouse for approximately 16 minutes. During that period, according to fire department analysis, accelerant had been deliberately distributed throughout the loading dock area and connected hallway. Multiple ignition points suggested systematic arson rather than accidental fire. The fire had been set with knowledge of the building's layout, suggesting familiarity, which Mitchell absolutely possessed from his 6 months of employment there. At 12:03 a.m., the figure exited the warehouse through the same service entrance, the canvas bag noticeably lighter, now containing the tools used in the arson rather than the materials. The figure moved quickly toward the parking lot, where Mitchell's Honda Civic sat waiting. Within minutes, the vehicle departed the warehouse district. At 12:17 a.m., 14 minutes after Mitchell's vehicle left the location, the first fire alarms triggered. The accelerant, deliberately positioned for maximum spread and intensity, had ignited with the timing precision of someone familiar with the chemical properties of the materials being used. Fire investigators, reanalyzing the burn patterns in light of this new evidence, recognized systematic distribution, consistent with professional arson, rather than accidental fire. The burn patterns suggested the fire had been deliberately set to spread throughout the loading dock and adjacent areas, consuming evidence, destroying the building's contents, and ultimately creating the tragedy that claimed Marcus Webb's life. The warehouse's security system records, which had been briefly examined but then dismissed as irrelevant when investigators focused on David Hartley, were now re-examined with fresh perspective. Access logs from the warehouse's electronic security system showed that James Mitchell's employee access card had been used to unlock the service entrance at 11:47 p.m. on March 15th. Mitchell had maintained possession of that access card even after being terminated 6 months earlier, a detail that now seemed profoundly significant. He had kept the card deliberately, clearly anticipating he would need it for the arson he was planning. Dr. Chen compiled all of this forensic evidence into a comprehensive report spanning 47 pages of detailed analysis, chemical specifications, timeline reconstruction, and scientific documentation. Every statement was supported by peer-reviewed methodology. Every conclusion was grounded in established forensic principles. The report was, in essence, an unshakable scientific confirmation of what Detectives Alert had suggested. James Mitchell was the perpetrator of the Riverside warehouse arson. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, which had assumed jurisdiction over the case due to its interstate implications and the involvement of insurance fraud, added their own analysis to the growing evidentiary mountain. FBI forensic specialists examined Mitchell's vehicle, where they discovered accelerant residue in the trunk, in the passenger seat, and on the floor mats, residue consistent with the substances used in the fire. The vehicle's interior told the story of careful but ultimately futile cleanup attempts. Mitchell had tried to remove evidence, but professional forensic analysis revealed what casual observation could never identify. Insurance company investigators, working parallel to law enforcement, documented that the insurance policy Mitchell had taken out on warehouse equipment was fraudulent. The equipment covered in the policy didn't actually exist in the quantities claimed. Mitchell had essentially created a phantom inventory that he intended to collect insurance money for when the warehouse burned. The fraud was comprehensive, deliberately structured, and represented years of methodical planning for financial gain through arson. Detective Sarah Reeves sat across from James Mitchell once again in the interrogation room, this time with Dr. Chen's comprehensive forensic report in front of her. Mitchell's earlier attempts at denial had been replaced by a kind of hollow resignation. He could see the evidence piling up, literally piling up, page after page of scientific documentation, and he understood that resistance was futile. "Your jacket carries identical accelerant traces to the warehouse fire scene," Reeves said methodically. "Your shoes contain soil from the exact location where the fire was ignited. Your residence contained arson materials and documentation of warehouse layout. Your vehicle was tracked in the warehouse district at the precise time of the arson. Security footage shows someone matching your description entering the warehouse and exiting minutes before ignition. Your employee access card was used to unlock the service entrance, and you maintained a fraudulent insurance policy to profit from the building's destruction." Mitchell stared at the table, his hands trembling slightly. The scientific evidence, accumulated through months of investigation and forensic analysis, investigation that had only accelerated and intensified following Detectives Alert, had constructed an evidentiary framework from which there was no escape, no credible counter-narrative, no plausible explanation that could withstand scrutiny. One faithful police dog's instinct had initiated a forensic cascade that had taken nearly 200 hours of laboratory analysis, thousands of dollars in sophisticated equipment utilization, and the combined expertise of multiple forensic disciplines to confirm. But the confirmation was absolute, scientific, and irrefutable. James Mitchell had burned down Riverside Warehouse, and in doing so, he had murdered Marcus Webb. The interrogation room at the Portland Police Department's Major Crimes Division felt increasingly claustrophobic as James Mitchell stared at the accumulating evidence spread across the table before him. Detective Sarah Reeves sat perfectly still, her experienced eyes watching Mitchell's face, reading the microexpressions and body language that revealed the psychological collapse occurring within the man across from her. Mitchell's earlier defensiveness, his protestations of innocence, his attempts at constructing alternative narratives, all of it had evaporated, replaced by a kind of hollow emptiness that suggested his psychological defenses were finally crumbling. "I think," Mitchell said quietly, his voice barely audible, "I want to tell you what actually happened." Reeves didn't immediately respond. She had been an interrogator long enough to recognize the delicate psychological moment when a suspect's resistance finally broke. She simply waited, allowing silence to fill the space, understanding that sometimes the most powerful interrogation technique was simply allowing the suspect to speak without interruption or judgment. Mitchell began slowly, haltingly, his words initially disjointed and difficult to articulate. But gradually, as he spoke, his narrative gained coherence, becoming a confession that revealed years of resentment, financial desperation, careful planning, and ultimately catastrophic moral failure. "I worked at that warehouse," Mitchell began, his eyes fixed on a spot on the table. "I was a good employee. I showed up on time, I did my job, I didn't cause problems. But the owner, he was corrupt. I found evidence that he was running insurance scams, deliberately underreporting inventory values, collecting insurance money on phantom equipment. I reported it to him, thinking he would fix it. Instead, he fired me and told security I had been stealing." Mitchell's voice carried genuine resentment as he recounted this history. Whether his interpretation of the warehouse owner's activities was accurate remained to be determined, but his emotional response to the termination was clearly authentic. "After I was fired, I was angry," Mitchell continued. "I couldn't find work for 3 months, my savings depleted. I started gambling thinking I could make quick money, but I lost everything. I accumulated debts. Serious debts. Loan sharks were calling me, threatening me. I was going to lose my apartment. I couldn't pay my basic bills." He paused, swallowing hard, as if gathering courage to confess the thoughts that had led to catastrophe. "I kept thinking about that warehouse," Mitchell said. "About how the owner was corrupt, how he had ruined my life, how he deserved to suffer the same way he had made me suffer. I researched arson. I learned about accelerants, about how fires work, about how to destroy evidence. It took me 4 months to plan everything. 4 months of studying the warehouse's layout, of researching insurance fraud, of understanding how to make it look accidental." "Tell me about the insurance policy," Reeves said, her voice carefully neutral. Mitchell's expression darkened. "I created false documentation. I claimed the warehouse contained equipment worth $45,000, equipment that didn't actually exist, or at least not in the quantities I claimed. I knew if the warehouse burned, the insurance would pay out. I intended to claim the money, disappear, and pay off my debts in another state with a new identity." "But something went wrong," Reeves said, understanding that this was the critical juncture where Mitchell's intention and reality had diverged. "I didn't know anyone was in the building," Mitchell said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I swear I didn't know. I had watched the warehouse for weeks, monitoring when people arrived and left. On the night of March 15th, I observed everyone leaving. I thought the building was empty. I thought it was just property destruction, just insurance fraud. I wasn't trying to kill anyone." "But someone was in there," Reeves pressed gently. "Marcus Webb." "I didn't know," Mitchell repeated, his voice rising slightly. "He was the night janitor. He must have been in a section of the building I hadn't observed. I set the fire in the loading dock area in the hallway leading to the main warehouse space. I thought the fire would spread slowly, that it would give anyone inside time to evacuate if they were somehow present. But accelerant burns hot, burns fast. I underestimated how quickly the fire would spread. By the time I left the warehouse, the fire was already moving faster than I anticipated. Mitchell's voice had become almost monotone, as if he were describing events that had happened to someone else, a psychological distancing mechanism that allowed him to articulate the confession without complete emotional collapse. "I drove away," Mitchell continued. "I was listening to the radio. About 20 minutes after I left, I heard emergency dispatch calls about a structure fire at Riverside Warehouse. Then, within an hour, they reported a fatality. A worker had been trapped inside." Reeves watched Mitchell's face as he recounted this moment. Genuine horror and remorse seemed evident in his expression, though she had learned through years of interrogation that guilty individuals could often manufacture convincing emotional displays. "Did you know who died?" Reeves asked. "Not immediately," Mitchell said, "but when I heard they had identified a janitor named Marcus Webb, something broke inside me. I went home and I sat there for hours just staring at nothing. I had killed someone. I had burned down a building and murdered an innocent man. Everything I had done, all the planning, all the careful preparation, it had been for nothing. The insurance policy became meaningless. The $45,000 became blood money that I couldn't possibly accept without destroying what was left of my conscience." "Yet you went to work as a court stenographer," Reeves observed. "You continued your normal routine, observed the trial of David Hartley, an innocent man being prosecuted for your crime." Mitchell's eyes closed, his jaw clenched. "I know. I told myself I could live with it. I told myself that if David Hartley was convicted, if justice was served, even if it was served on the wrong person, then maybe I could find some way to justify what I had done. It was a terrible rationalization. I knew it was wrong, but I was too much of a coward to turn myself in." "Until Detective alerted on you in the courtroom," Reeves said. "Until that dog," Mitchell agreed, opening his eyes. "That dog was perfect. It knew exactly what I had done. It identified me without hesitation, without doubt. It was like the universe itself was rejecting my attempt to hide, to pretend, to let an innocent man take the fall for my actions." Mitchell's hands trembled visibly as he continued. "When Detective alerted on me, it felt like a kind of karmic judgment. 7 years of that dog's perfect record, never wrong, never uncertain, and it identified me. I realized in that moment that I couldn't continue the lie. I couldn't let David Hartley go to prison for something he didn't do. I couldn't live with myself knowing that an innocent man was being convicted while I sat in a courtroom pretending to be neutral and objective." "So you're confessing to arson resulting in death," Reeves said, her voice formal, official. "You're admitting to deliberately setting fire to Riverside Warehouse on March 15th, knowing that such action created substantial risk of human death and resulting in the death of Marcus Webb." "Yes," Mitchell said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm confessing to everything. I set the fire. I killed Marcus Webb. I was prepared to let an innocent man take the fall for my crime. I am guilty of all of it." Reeves activated the recording device that had been running throughout the interrogation, ensuring that Mitchell's confession was captured in its entirety for evidentiary purposes. She read Mitchell his Miranda rights once more, ensuring everything was procedurally correct despite his waiver of those rights at the interrogation's beginning. What had begun with David Hartley facing certain conviction for a murder he didn't commit had transformed, in the space of a few hours, into a complete confession from the actual perpetrator. The chain of events that had led to this breaking point had started with one faithful police dog walking into a courtroom and recognizing what human investigators had completely missed. James Mitchell's carefully constructed facade, his meticulous planning, his attempts at concealment through false identity and deliberate evidence destruction, all of it had been obliterated by a dog's alert, and the subsequent forensic investigation that had unraveled his entire narrative. The confession represented not just Mitchell's acknowledgement of guilt, but also the vindication of detectives' perfect instincts and the beginning of justice, real justice, for Marcus Webb's family and for David Hartley, who had come terrifyingly close to sacrificing his entire life for a crime he had nothing to do with. The courthouse corridors buzzed with unprecedented activity as news of James Mitchell's confession spread through law enforcement, legal circles, and the media with remarkable speed. Judge Patricia Morrison had reconvened the court within hours of Mitchell's admissions to investigators, understanding the extraordinary circumstances that demanded immediate judicial attention. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance with traditional formality, but the courtroom atmosphere bore no resemblance to the tense, adversarial environment that had characterized the previous 3 weeks of trial proceedings. David Hartley sat at the defendant's table, but now his public defender, Robert Sullivan, sat beside him with an expression of vindication rather than desperation. Hartley himself appeared almost disbelieving, as if his mind couldn't quite process the reality that his nightmare was ending. His mother and sister occupied the front row of the gallery, their faces streaked with tears, tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotional release after weeks of anguish. District Attorney Richard Hammond sat at the prosecution table, his earlier confidence and theatrical certainty completely dismantled. He had prepared to deliver what he believed would be a triumphant closing argument, followed by a jury verdict that would cement his conviction record. Instead, he now sat witnessing the complete exoneration of the defendant he had worked so diligently to convict. The professional blow to his record and reputation was evident in his rigid posture and the way his eyes avoided meeting Hartley's gaze. "This court has been informed," Judge Morrison began, her judicial authority carrying absolute weight, "of significant new evidence that has come to light during the recess. Specifically, a confession has been obtained from James Mitchell, the individual on whom a police K-9 unit alerted during this proceeding. The confession details Mr. Mitchell's deliberate and intentional arson of Riverside Warehouse, resulting in the death of Marcus Webb. Given this confession and the supporting forensic evidence, this court finds that the charges against David Hartley are no longer supported by credible evidence." The judge paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. "Mr. Hartley," Judge Morrison continued, her eyes focusing directly on the defendant, "you are hereby acquitted of all charges related to the arson and death of Marcus Webb. You are free to leave this courtroom without any legal impediment to your future. The state of Oregon withdraws all charges and apologizes for the prosecution of an innocent individual." The courtroom seemed to collectively exhale. David Hartley's mother gasped audibly, her hand covering her mouth as tears flowed freely. His sister stood and embraced their mother, both women crying with the kind of profound relief that comes from imminent disaster being averted. Hartley himself appeared momentarily frozen, as if his brain couldn't quite process that his ordeal was actually ending, that he wasn't going to prison, that his life hadn't been destroyed by a terrible miscarriage of justice. Robert Sullivan placed his hand on Hartley's shoulder, squeezing gently. "You're free, David. You're completely free." Hartley's own tears began to flow, not tears of sadness or fear, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and emotional catharsis. He stood on unsteady legs and was immediately surrounded by his family, embracing his mother and sister in a tangle of arms and sobbing relief. The reunion was deeply human, profoundly emotional, and visible proof of what wrongful conviction avoidance looked like in its most genuine, authentic form. Judge Morrison called for order, her gavel establishing courtroom decorum despite the emotional turmoil evident throughout the gallery. She then turned her attention to District Attorney Hammond. "The District Attorney's office," Morrison said, her tone reflecting both professionalism and subtle rebuke, "has the opportunity to issue a formal apology to Mr. Hartley and his family for the prosecution of this case. Furthermore, I strongly recommend a comprehensive review of investigative procedures and evidence evaluation protocols that allowed an innocent individual to be prosecuted with such confidence, while exculpatory evidence was overlooked. Hammond stood slowly, his expression reflecting genuine distress. Whether his distress stemmed from professional embarrassment, genuine remorse for the almost miscarriage of justice, or concern about the implications for his future political career was unclear. He addressed the court formally. This office acknowledges that we prosecuted David Hartley based on available evidence at the time of prosecution, Hammond said, his words carefully lawyered. However, we recognize that significant evidence was overlooked during initial investigation. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Hartley and his family for the trauma and disruption this prosecution has caused. This office will cooperate fully with any investigation into our prosecutorial procedures and will implement reforms to prevent similar oversights in future cases. It was a carefully constructed statement that acknowledged wrongdoing without admitting prosecutorial misconduct or creating liability that might result in civil litigation against the district attorney's office. But to everyone in the courtroom, the message was clear. The prosecution had made a profound error, and an innocent man had nearly paid the ultimate price, decades of imprisonment for that error. Following the court's formal dismissal, the media descended like a swarm of locusts. Journalists with cameras, microphones, and notebooks surrounded David Hartley and his family as they exited the courthouse. The story had evolved from a straightforward arson prosecution into a dramatic narrative about wrongful conviction, police K-9 heroism, and the fragility of justice when investigative procedures failed to identify the actual perpetrator. "Mr. Hartley, how do you feel about being exonerated?" a reporter shouted. Hartley, still in a kind of emotional daze, attempted to respond. I'm grateful that this dog detective, that he alerted on the right person. I'm grateful for Officer Chen and for the police department for taking that alert seriously instead of dismissing it. If that dog hadn't done what he did, I would be sitting in a prison cell right now for something I didn't do. An innocent man would be destroyed, and a guilty man would be free. His mother spoke next, her voice trembling with emotion. My son spent 3 weeks being prosecuted for a crime he didn't commit. 3 weeks of terror, of uncertainty, of watching his entire life being destroyed by the legal system. That police dog saved my son's life. He saved our family. We will never forget what detective did for us. Officer Marcus Chen, standing slightly apart from the Hartley family with detective at his side, watched the scene unfold with visible emotion. Detective, ever the professional, remained calm and composed despite the cameras, the noise, and the chaos swirling around him. The dog had already done his job, done it perfectly, with absolute certainty and flawless accuracy. The remainder of the proceedings, the legal mechanics and human drama, were beyond his concern or comprehension. A reporter approached Officer Chen directly. Officer Chen, detective alerted on James Mitchell in the courtroom. That's unprecedented. How did you know to take that alert seriously when the defendant was seated elsewhere in the courtroom? Chen responded carefully, choosing his words with professional precision. Detective has been trained for 7 years to identify accelerant residue with absolute accuracy. He has never given a false alert in his career. When he alerted in that courtroom, I trusted his instincts completely. I knew from 7 years of working with this dog that if he was alerting, he was identifying something real. I followed his lead, and the evidence has proven that his instinct was absolutely correct. Later that afternoon, in a quieter setting away from the media frenzy, David Hartley met privately with Officer Chen and Detective. Hartley knelt beside the dog, his hands trembling as he gently stroked Detective's head and neck. Detective, with the gentle nature that all well-trained service dogs possessed, allowed the contact, seemingly understanding the profound gratitude being communicated through physical touch. Thank you, Hartley whispered to the dog, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for knowing what I didn't do." Detective's tail wagged slowly, his dark eyes meeting Hartley's with what appeared to be genuine canine recognition of the human connection being forged in that moment. Officer Chen stood nearby, respecting the interaction, understanding that this meeting represented something far beyond professional obligation. It represented the convergence of human justice and animal instinct, of law enforcement and loyalty, of one innocent man's gratitude toward the faithful dog who had prevented his destruction. That evening, David Hartley made a decision that would shape the remainder of his life. He would become an advocate for wrongful conviction cases. He would speak publicly about the trauma of being prosecuted for a crime he didn't commit. He would work to reform investigative procedures and prosecutorial protocols that had allowed his case to progress so far despite his obvious innocence. And he would dedicate himself to ensuring that other innocent individuals didn't experience the horror that had nearly consumed him, a horror from which he had been rescued by one remarkable police dog's unwavering commitment to truth. Within 48 hours of David Hartley's exoneration, the story of Detective's courtroom alert had captured the attention of national media outlets. Cable news networks featured the case prominently, with segments exploring the unprecedented nature of a police K-9 unit identifying the actual perpetrator during an active murder trial. Major newspapers published detailed articles examining how a trained detection dog had accomplished what weeks of traditional investigation had failed to achieve. The narrative was compelling, dramatic, and fundamentally important to conversations about criminal justice, investigative procedure, and the reliability of police work. The American Kennel Club, the nation's most prestigious dog registry and authority on canine matters, formally recognized Detective as Dog of the Year, an honor typically reserved for service dogs whose actions had demonstrated extraordinary impact on human welfare. Detective's photograph appeared on the cover of the AKC Gazette, accompanied by a detailed article documenting his 7-year career, his flawless detection record, and his role in preventing a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. The recognition elevated Detective from a respected police dog to a nationally recognized symbol of canine excellence and the potential for human-animal partnership to serve justice. The Portland Police Department's Public Information Office received hundreds of interview requests from national media outlets. Officer Marcus Chen, initially uncomfortable with the attention, gradually recognized the opportunity to educate the public about police K-9 training, handler-dog relationships, and the scientific basis for accelerant detection. He appeared on morning television programs, evening news broadcasts, and specialized documentary programs that examined the intersection of law enforcement and canine science. During one particularly prominent interview on a national news program, Chen explained the training methodology that had created Detective's extraordinary capabilities. Detection dogs like Detective undergo thousands of hours of training, Chen explained to the interviewer and millions of viewers watching from their homes. They're trained to recognize specific chemical signatures and to alert their handler when they detect those signatures. Detective can identify accelerant compounds at concentrations as low as 1 part per trillion, a sensitivity that no human nose could ever approach. He's not guessing. He's not responding to behavioral cues or unconscious handler bias. He's identifying actual chemical evidence that human investigators missed. The interviewer pressed further. But alerting in a courtroom on someone other than the defendant during an active trial, that's extraordinary, isn't it? How did you have the confidence to take that alert seriously? Chen paused, choosing his words carefully. I've worked with Detective for 7 years. I've trained him, trusted him, depended on him in countless situations. When Detective alerted in that courtroom, I recognized immediately that something significant was occurring. I could have dismissed his alert. That would have been easier, less disruptive to the proceedings. But 7 years of partnership had taught me that Detective doesn't make mistakes. His instinct was more reliable than my judgment in that moment. I trusted the dog, and that trust resulted in an innocent man being freed and a guilty man being identified. Police training facilities across the United States began studying detectives' case as a model for K-9 program excellence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's K-9 Training Division invited Officer Chen to conduct seminars for federal agents responsible for managing detection dogs. State police agencies in California, Washington, Idaho, Colorado, and Texas requested consultation from Chen regarding implementation of enhanced K-9 training protocols. Law enforcement conferences featured detectives' case as a centerpiece of discussions about improving investigation procedures and recognizing the critical value of properly trained detection animals. Perhaps most significantly, academic institutions began incorporating detectives' case into their curricula. Law schools across America added the Mitchell trial to evidence and criminal procedure courses, using the case to examine questions about the reliability of K-9 alerts, the admissibility of such alerts as evidence, and the intersection of animal-based detection and human legal procedures. University veterinary schools reference detectives' case when teaching about canine olfactory capabilities and the science underlying detection dog training. Criminal justice programs analyzed the investigative failure that had nearly resulted in Hartley's wrongful conviction, using the case to illustrate the importance of comprehensive evidence evaluation and the dangers of investigative tunnel vision. The State Bar Association of Oregon formally recognized Officer Chen and detective in a ceremony attended by prominent judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and law enforcement officials. The recognition specifically acknowledged detectives' unprecedented contribution to preventing a wrongful conviction and ensuring that actual justice served on the person actually guilty of the crime, had been achieved. The certificate of recognition hung in the Portland Police Department's headquarters, a permanent testament to the partnership between handler and dog that had changed the trajectory of a criminal case. David Hartley, newly exonerated and determined to transform his traumatic experience into meaningful advocacy, reached out to national organizations focusing on wrongful convictions. He began speaking at conferences, appearing on podcasts, and writing articles about his experience of being prosecuted for a crime he didn't commit. His narrative was powerful and emotionally authentic. A young man whose life had nearly been permanently destroyed by investigative failure and prosecutorial confidence based on incomplete evidence. "I came within days of being convicted," Hartley told audiences at wrongful conviction conferences. "If detective hadn't alerted in that courtroom, if Officer Chen hadn't trusted his dog's instinct, I would be sitting in a prison cell right now. I would have lost decades of my life. My family would have been destroyed, all because investigators failed to identify the actual perpetrator and became focused on me as the convenient suspect." Hartley's advocacy attracted attention from organizations like the Innocence Project, which specialized in exonerating innocent individuals through DNA evidence and investigative review. While Hartley's case hadn't involved DNA evidence, it had involved police dog detection and forensic analysis of accelerant residue. His story demonstrated the broader principles of wrongful conviction prevention that the Innocence Project promoted: thorough investigation, consideration of alternative suspects, and avoidance of investigative tunnel vision. The National Police K-9 Association created the Detective Award in honor of the Portland police dog, to be presented annually to police K-9 units whose work had resulted in significant contributions to criminal justice. The award's inaugural recipient was, naturally, Detective himself, with Officer Chen accepting the recognition at the association's national conference. The award established a legacy that would recognize other detection dogs for similar excellence in years to come. Law enforcement journals and professional publications featured extensive articles examining detectives' case. The role of canine detection in modern criminal investigation appeared in the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin. K9 Reliability and Courtroom Admissibility was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. These academic publications elevated detectives' case from a local news story into the broader conversation about criminal investigation best practices, ensuring that his example would influence law enforcement training and procedure for years to come. Officer Marcus Chen received a promotion to lieutenant, recognition of both his exceptional work with detective and his emerging expertise in K9 training and management. He was appointed to head a newly created K9 division within the Portland Police Department, with a specific mandate to review cold cases where K9 detection might provide investigative leads that traditional methods had failed to generate. Chen understood the extraordinary potential of properly trained detection dogs to identify evidence and perpetrators that human investigators might miss, and he was determined to expand that potential across his department's jurisdiction. The promotion represented far more than professional advancement for Chen. It represented institutional recognition that the bond between handler and dog, and the scientific foundation underlying canine detection, deserved serious investment and professional development. Chen began recruiting and training additional K9 units, implementing the protocols that had made detectives so extraordinarily effective, and creating a culture within the department that valued canine detection as a critical tool in modern criminal investigation. Media coverage expanded beyond law enforcement and criminal justice circles. Magazines like National Geographic, Smithsonian, and The Atlantic published feature articles exploring the science of canine olfaction and the remarkable capabilities that made dogs like Detective so invaluable to human justice systems. These publications reached audiences far beyond law enforcement professionals, educating the general public about the extraordinary sensory abilities of dogs and the potential for human-animal partnership to serve profound purposes. Detective himself, now recognized nationally as a hero and symbol of justice, became a celebrity in certain circles. Schools and community centers invited Officer Chen and Detective to conduct educational presentations about police K9 work. Children would line up to meet the famous dog, many having read about Detective in age-appropriate news articles or learned about his case in school discussions about justice and the legal system. Detective, ever the professional, accepted the attention with calm dignity, seemingly understanding that his role extended beyond criminal investigation into public education about the capabilities and importance of properly trained police dogs. The case had transformed not just the lives of David Hartley and James Mitchell, but had influenced conversations about criminal justice across the nation. Detective had become more than a police dog with an impressive detection record. He had become a symbol of the potential for justice to be served correctly, for innocent people to be protected, and for the remarkable capabilities of animals to contribute meaningfully to human systems of law and order. His 7-year perfect record had culminated in his greatest achievement, preventing an innocent man from spending decades in prison for a crime perpetrated by someone else. Detective's final years unfolded in a landscape transformed by the recognition and accolades that followed his extraordinary courtroom alert. As the dog entered his 11th and then 12th year of life, ancient in canine terms, Officer Marcus Chen made the difficult decision to retire Detective from active police duty. The dog had earned his rest, had contributed immeasurably to criminal justice, and deserved to spend his final years in peaceful retirement rather than continuing the physical and mental demands of detection work. Detective moved into Officer Chen's home as a permanent family resident, leaving behind the police station and the equipment that had defined his professional career. The transition from working dog to retiree was handled with the same professionalism that had characterized every other aspect of Chen's relationship with his partner. Detective's retirement was announced to the media, prompting another wave of nostalgic articles celebrating the dog's career and his unprecedented role in criminal justice. In his retirement, Detective lived comfortably with Chen's family, Chen's wife, their 2 teenage children, and 2 other family dogs. Detective spent his days resting in the sunshine streaming through living room windows, playing gently with the younger family dogs, and enjoying the kind of peaceful domestic existence that few working dogs experience. The dog who had walked into a courtroom and changed the trajectory of a murder case now spent his days in quiet contentment, his extraordinary work completed. Law schools across America had by now firmly established Detective's case as a permanent fixture in criminal procedure and evidence courses. The Mitchell trial and the role of K-9 detection in criminal investigation became a standard case study at Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, Columbia Law School, and dozens of other institutions training the next generation of attorneys and judges. Legal scholars published extensively about the case, examining questions about the admissibility of K-9 alerts as evidence, the reliability of detection dogs, and the intersection of animal-based detection and human legal systems. The American Criminal Justice Association published comprehensive guidelines titled K-9 Detection Evidence, Standards for Admissibility and Reliability, that directly reference Detective's case. These guidelines establish protocols for how K-9 alerts should influence investigative direction, when such alerts should be considered sufficient basis for suspect identification, and what additional evidence should be required before prosecution could proceed. The guidelines represented an attempt to systematize the lessons learned from Detective's extraordinary performance, and to ensure that future law enforcement agencies could benefit from the experience of the Mitchell trial. James Mitchell had been convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison for arson resulting in manslaughter, with the possibility of parole only after serving at least 20 years of his sentence. The trial that followed his confession was considerably less dramatic than Hartley's trial had been. Mitchell's guilt was overwhelming, documented, and undeniable. The prosecution that had pursued Mitchell with such certainty was prosecuted with such certainty that the trial lasted only 6 days before Mitchell entered a guilty plea, rather than prolonging proceedings that would inevitably result in conviction. Mitchell's incarceration represented not just punishment for his crimes, but also a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing financial desperation and resentment to metastasize into destructive action. Prison psychologists and criminologists studied Mitchell's case to understand the psychological and social factors that had driven an ordinary court stenographer to deliberately commit arson and murder. Mitchell's motivation, financial desperation combined with resentment toward an employer he blamed for his downfall, became a case study in criminal psychology courses examining the etiology of serious crime. The warehouse owner, devastated by the destruction of his business and the loss of innocent life, had initially considered abandoning the rebuilding effort. But gradually, driven by a determination not to allow the tragedy to completely define his legacy, he began reconstruction. The new warehouse that rose from the ashes of the fire was built with enhanced safety features, comprehensive security systems, and a commitment to employee welfare that exceeded industry standards. The warehouse owner dedicated a section of the new facility to a memorial for Marcus Webb, the night janitor whose life had been claimed by Mitchell's arson. A bronze plaque at the warehouse entrance read, "In memory of Marcus Webb, a dedicated worker, loving father, and irreplaceable member of our community. His life was taken by deliberate arson on March 15th. His legacy inspires us to build safer workplaces and to honor the dignity of all workers." The memorial became a pilgrimage site for criminal justice advocates, for families affected by wrongful prosecution, and for individuals interested in understanding the human cost of investigative failure and prosecutorial tunnel vision. School groups visited the memorial, learning about Marcus Webb's life and death, while also learning about how detectives' alert had prevented an innocent man from being imprisoned for the crime. David Hartley had flourished in his post-exoneration life, transforming his traumatic experience into meaningful advocacy work. He founded the Second Chance Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to reviewing cases where innocent individuals had been wrongfully convicted or nearly convicted. The organization worked with law enforcement agencies, prosecutorial offices, and criminal justice reformers to implement investigative protocols designed to reduce the likelihood of wrongful convictions. Hartley served as the organization's executive director, drawing upon his personal experience and his commitment to ensuring that other innocent people didn't suffer the terror and trauma that he had endured. The Second Chance Initiative prominently featured detectives' case as an example of how proper investigative procedure, combined with openness to evidence that contradicted initial assumptions, could prevent wrongful convictions. Hartley frequently spoke about detective during public presentations, crediting the dog and Officer Chen with literally saving his life. "That police dog," Hartley told audiences at criminal justice conferences, understood truth in a way that human investigators sometimes miss. Detective didn't have preconceived notions about who was guilty. He didn't have investigative tunnel vision. He simply detected what was actually there, accelerant residue on a person who had deliberately set a fire. Because Detective was allowed to do his job, because Officer Chen trusted his dog's instinct, an innocent man was freed and a guilty man was identified. That's justice working the way it's supposed to work. Hartley's advocacy work attracted significant philanthropic support. Major foundations provided grants to the Second Chance Initiative, enabling Hartley to expand the organization's work beyond Oregon into other states. The initiative reviewed dozens of cases annually, identifying cases where procedural improvements might have prevented wrongful conviction and working with criminal justice systems to implement reforms. When Detective finally passed away at the advanced age of 12, an unusually long lifespan for a large dog, the death received national media coverage. News outlets that had reported on his courtroom alert years earlier now reported on his peaceful passing, his body honored with a full police funeral ceremony. Law enforcement officers from departments across the Pacific Northwest attended the service, a remarkable show of respect for a dog who had dedicated his life to justice. Detective's body was laid to rest in a special cemetery for police and service animals located near Portland. His grave marker bore his name, his service dates, and a simple inscription: Detective, in service of justice, 2011-2023, a perfect record, a faithful partner, a hero. Officer Marcus Chen, now a senior lieutenant within the Portland Police Department overseeing multiple K-9 units, attended the funeral with his family. His children, who had grown up with Detective in their home, mourned the loss of a dog who had been not just a working partner but a beloved family member. Chen stood at Detective's graveside, his hand on his wife's shoulder, and reflected on the extraordinary journey that he and Detective had shared. "He was the best partner I ever had," Chen said quietly to his family. "He was better at his job than I was at mine. He saw what I missed. He knew what I didn't know. He changed everything." In the years following Detective's death, his legacy continued to expand and evolve. Universities established scholarship programs named in honor of Detective, providing funding for students pursuing careers in canine sciences or criminal justice. The American Kennel Club created the Detective Memorial Award, presented annually to K-9 units whose work had demonstrated exceptional excellence and contribution to criminal justice. Law enforcement training academies across the nation incorporated Detective's story into their K-9 training programs, using his case to illustrate the potential for properly trained detection dogs to serve justice in ways that traditional investigation could not. New generations of police officers learned about Detective, understanding that the bond between handler and dog represented one of the most reliable tools available to modern law enforcement. The Portland Police Department established a detective memorial garden on the grounds of their headquarters, featuring a bronze statue of Detective in an alert posture, his nose slightly raised, his body rigid with the kind of certainty that had characterized his final and most famous detection. A plaque beneath the statue read, "Detective, a faithful partner, a perfect record, a hero who changed justice." His alert in the courtroom prevented a wrongful conviction and ensured that justice was served on the guilty. Detective reminds us that truth sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, and that justice depends on listening to voices, human and animal, that speak truth with unwavering certainty. The Mitchell case became incorporated into legal, criminal justice, and veterinary curricula across America. Books were written about Detective's extraordinary career. Documentaries explored the science of canine detection and the remarkable partnership between Officer Chen and his dog. Graduate students completed dissertations examining the case's implications for criminal investigation procedure and prosecutorial practice. Most importantly, David Hartley lived his life as a free man, building a successful business, starting a family, and dedicating himself to ensuring that other innocent people didn't experience the horror of wrongful prosecution. His organization, the Second Chance Initiative, had by the 20th anniversary of Detective's Courtroom Alert been instrumental in identifying and addressing investigative failures in over 200 cases. Some of those cases resulted in exonerations of innocent individuals. Others resulted in procedural reforms that prevented wrongful convictions from occurring in the first place. At every major milestone in his life, business successes, family celebrations, professional achievements, Hartley thought about Detective, the dog who had quite literally saved his life by walking into a courtroom and recognizing what human investigators had completely missed. He frequently visited Detective's grave, leaving flowers and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that one faithful dog had initiated by following his nose and trusting his training on a day that had changed everything. The story of Detective, Officer Chen, David Hartley, and James Mitchell became more than a local news story or a case study in legal education. It became a testament to the power of justice when systems work correctly, when investigators remain open to evidence that contradicts their initial assumptions, and when human beings, and sometimes the animals that partner with them, have the courage to pursue truth regardless of the disruption that truth might create. Detective's perfect record, his unwavering instinct, and his faithful service to justice had transformed not just one man's life, but had influenced criminal justice systems across an entire nation, ensuring that future innocent people might be protected from the terror of wrongful conviction by learning from the remarkable lessons that one extraordinary police dog had taught.